Ryloth, Endgame, =RK=, Part 2. Lorik Pass, Torangwa Mountains, Ryloth. Maximilian Viers watched the sensors display of his command tank like a hawk. The young officer was leading the vanguard of one of the armor columns braving the mountains. He was currently commanding a hover tank platoon, which was scouting ahead of the main force. Above him, a pair of heavily armed gunships were lazily sweeping over the pass. Higher still, a couple of squadrons of fighters were flying cap, on the lookout for any sign of Cis vultures or bombers. Even in orbit, the ultimate high ground, a Venator, the Victory, was hanging vigilant, ready to provide assistance if needed. All that didn't make the lieutenant any less apprehensive. He was in a light tank, with only a shield generator for defense. One that maybe could take 2 shots before being overloaded. You had to add to that the unpleasant fact that his hovercraft were no good for scaling vertical surfaces, such as the cliffs to the left, or flying, with the over 2 kilometers deep chasm on the right. In front of his vehicle were 2 tanks of his command squad, both of which had their turrets sweeping from left to right in search of hostiles. Contact. You have enemy tanks and infantry activating to northeast. The voice of the Victory's sensor operator sounded from comms all along the armor column. Affirmative. We have them on our screens. Confirmed the pilots of the gunships. We are engaging. Lieutenant Viers. Push the vanguard forward and try to flush out any other surprises the Seps have for us. Ordered General Vale, who was riding with a group of quick response LARTs, which had 2 companies of troopers ready to deploy. Will go, sir, answered the younger man. You heard, the general. We are moving out. I want 500 meters separation between the platoon's elements. The hover tank's engines roared and the light machine started forward, following the contour of the pass. =RK=. The gunships flew over the mountain's peaks and followed the siren song of the droid's energy emissions. Those 2 LARTs were heavily armed with both missile and rocket pods as well as rapid-fire lasers mounted under their short wings. The pair appeared over the Cis forces. The Separatists' machines were getting out of shallow trenches, where they had waited deactivated for Republic forces to come in range. The lead LART released a couple of missiles aimed at 2 tanks which had gotten out of their hiding holes and were heading into firing positions over the GAR column. The heavy weapons struck the Cis machines from above, drilling effortlessly through their lighted top armor and detonating. The top third of the 2 stricken tanks disappeared into a flash of detonating explosives, and the resulting shockwave obliterated a few B-2 droids which were too close. That first successful strike was followed by the gunships unleashing the rest of their weaponry before they finished their attack pass. Missiles blew up 3 more tanks, while rockets and lances of energy smashed into groups of droids. The initial success of the LARTs was short-lived. The next Cis machine to awake was an AA emplacement, which opened up on the gunships. They were already finishing their strafing run and were able to avoid its initial flak fire. The 2 missiles it sent after them were a different matter. The Republic craft spread out, increasing their speed and turning so they could target the weapon which went after their comrade. One of the LARTs managed to shoot down the missile going after its wing mate, before it could connect with it. The fire of the second one missed by centimeters, twin stilettos of green energy passing below and above the Cis weapon. The missile struck the gunship from the side, destroying one engine and heavily damaging the other. The LART spun out of control and plowed in the rocky ground. The second one flew straight down in an attempt to go below the engagement envelope of the AA emplacement. That maneuver, as it turned out, was not needed. A missile sent from one of the cap fighters erased the AA site out of existence. Moments later, 6V-19 strafed the Cis position. =RK=. Lieutenant Viers glared at a mountain hill which was on the other side of the pass they were crossing. It was a good news/bad news thing. The Criffing Cis had a position defended by proton cannons and heavy AA emplacements, from where their tanks and infantry could take backshots at the advancing Republic column without being too concerned by air or orbital attacks. The second option was out anyway, if the general wanted to use this pass. But the heavy cannons ensured that a corvette or a light cruiser couldn't pass over the place where the Seps had entrenched themselves and plaster them with its secondaries. Not without getting shot down in retaliation. Which was a problem. The fleet couldn't afford to lose any more ships, even one of the lighter ones. Such a thing would compromise even further the tentative hold the Navy had over Ryloth. Not a single GAR member on the ground wanted to think what would happen if the Sys sent a heavy fleet to retake the orbitals. That left the ground forces with a problem. Now they had to brave a gauntlet under enemy fire. It wasn't a fun place to be. Two of the Sys tanks which had taken positions on the ridge overlooking the pass concentrated their fire on the leading part of Veer's platoon. They missed. Maximilian had never been more grateful to the Sep's own beam counters, who were too cheap to pay for a decent targeting sensors and programming for the droid ground forces. "Press forward. We need to get out of the pass ASAP and flank them," ordered the lieutenant. "Yes, sir." He heard his drivers shouting back a second before the tank darted forward, at a reckless speed. That was all Veers could do. The position where his platoon was didn't give him many options. They couldn't maneuver, or go back. Staying put would be a death sentence for his light tanks, and worse, would achieve nothing. The 11 hover tanks flew towards the end of the pass, while exchanging fire with the Sys forces. The only high point was that while the Seps were busy shooting at his shielded machines, they were not bombarding the ponderous walkers which were striding forth with unmatched determination. =RK Eagle Flight, Lorik Pass, Torangwa Mountains, Ryloth. A droid-operated tank took careful aim and fired. A fist made of crimson energy splashed over the shield of Maximilian's leading tank. The defensive field flashed brightly as it struggled to absorb and reflect the energies unleashed upon it, before the light show ended. The hover tank, which was still intact, rotated its turret and roared its defiance. Its lighter, but faster-firing cannon spoke. 3 green bolts flew back at the Sys lines. 1 missed. The rest found their mark. A deep, smoking rend appeared in the front armor of the enemy tank and the secondary weapons on the right side of its cupola were slagged by a hit. In retaliation, 4 more of the Confed machines zeroed on the leading hover tank and fired in unison. The shield stopped the first hit. The next pierced the depleted defensive barrier as if it was not even there. It sliced through the thin armor protecting the turret and unleashed what remained of its fury on the people manning the hover tank. The machine's commander, who acted a gunner too, was turned into ash from the waist up. The driver lived a bit longer thanks to the compartmentalization of the tank doing its job. That proved useless when the front of the armored vehicle was struck by another cannon shot, which blew a hole in the glacis and obliterated the man. I turned my senses towards the higher ground where the Sys forces had taken position. Their AA emplacements were already sending streams of laser fire and flocks of missiles at my cap, forcing the torrents back. The fighters answered with their own weapons, which were met by a wall of blaster fire. Only a handful of missiles got through, with only one reaching its target. The end result was an AA site blown up in exchange for a pair of V-19s. It wasn't a trade I could afford. Then another hover tank went in flames under the relentless enemy barrage. And I was grateful for it. I would gladly accept them blowing up my entire vanguard, despite Veers leading it, because it meant that the Criffing clankers weren't shooting at the pass itself. Granted, the whole exercise was a damn diversion, but I needed everyone seeing what they believed my forces were doing. It was probably my best chance to end the mess on Ryloth fast. So I was leading 3 regiments into a meat grinder while Kenobi prepared to do his part. That still left me to deal with the Sys forces on the damn hills overlooking the pass. Oh, I got a plan how to do it. It was just that a bunch of gunships from Earth would have been ideal for dealing with this situation. Flying through the pass, under the enemy AA umbrella, then popping a sensor pod over the edge of the canyon, locking on the targets and sending missiles to deal with them. It was too bad that thanks to the enemy ECM my own gunships were unable to do so. They needed a line of sight to fire and that was suicide against the massed AA emplacements. No orbital strike, an air attack being too costly on my remaining assets. And no Criffing indirect fire artillery. That was soon going to be climbing near the top of the list I needed the R&D to see. Few self-propelled arty pieces would have done wonders against the entrenched Sys forces. Hell, few mortars would do nicely too. Just another thing to add to the list. That left us dealing with the enemy the old-fashioned way. With grunts on the ground. The quick reaction force flew through the canyon until the LARTs were in position, just 2 meters under the edge of the cliffs where the droids deployed. Below us and to the left, the leading elements of my Walker force were coming into range. Their heavy mass drivers opened fire, carefully aiming so they won't smash one of my transports by accident. That at least kept the droids nicely distracted from our approach. My men launched grappling hooks, and once the devices found purchase on the rocks above us, they started climbing up. Once they were just below the edge, the clones drew thermal detonators and iron grenades with one hand, and threw them at the droids above us. It was what I was waiting for. I had mental picture of the enemy forces seared into my head thanks to the Force, which I had used to search for their exact positions. Streams of ionic energy clashed with blast waves and machines started dying. Squads of B-2s as well as tanks and couple of AA emplacement went out in a flash of searing fire or few twitching on the ground with their circuits fused. This brief surprise was all it took for the leading elements of my two companies to scale up the cliffs, discard the grappling hooks and scatter in search for cover. Arya and I joined them, jumping meters in the air from the lots carrying us. Our lightsabers were already active when we landed on the rough ground. We wasted no time and charged the enemy lines. Behind us my armored column had ceased fire and was advancing up the pass. I used my free hand to levitate grenades from my harness and sent them flying at various juicy targets, while blocking the ineffective fire from the droids. I dreaded the day when those things would get their programming straight and start acting as the advanced war machines I remembered from my past. Against them the assault I was leading would be magnitudes bloodier if successful at all. To my right, my apprentice was following my example. Her excitement and joy was like a beacon for my senses. I chuckled at her antics and threw a thermal detonator straight under the gun of a September tank, which was trying to acquire me as a target. The resulting explosion melted off most of the machine's armor around its turret and warped the cannon, making it useless. I frowned, but didn't allow myself to stop in surprise. The damn weapon was faulty. It should have destroyed the tank, not simply crippling it. The damn thing still had its secondary weapons which were moving my way. A missile slammed into the tank's weakened armor and blew it up. The second wave were up here and engaging. They were exclusively carrying heavy weapons. The third should be following us within moments. It was just in time, too. The Sith forces were finally straightening out their programming and were counterattacking. The droids which were acting as individuals when we surprised them were engaging us as units, with B2S and tanks engaging us in well-coordinated manner. The local Sith commander had re-established control. Joy. I ducked under a cannon shot. The bolt of concentrated energy passed over my head, and I rolled over the rocky ground. A repeating blaster stitched a line of smoking craters where I was a second ago. Arya drew the weapons operator a B1 towards herself and sliced it in two without slowing down. Then she vaulted over a boulder and landed amidst a squad of super battle droids. Her blade danced around her armored body, leaving pieces of glowing metal in its wake. My roll ended near an AA position. I threw my last thermal detonator into it, before making myself scarce. A geyser of dirt and flames erupted behind me. Arya was grinning as she charged through the Sith lines. The Force sang in her ears, and the apprentice grabbed it and forced it to follow her directions. She felt more powerful than ever, and more importantly, Arya felt in control. She was no longer just an ill-taught pawn whose lot in life was to be used and discarded. The Sith apprentice twisted the Force flowing through her veins and sent a bolt of lightning at a quartet of super battle droids. Their well-polished armor shone under the onslaught, but did nothing to slow down the stream of energy that fried their internal components. 4 metal sculptures fell to the ground, while Arya's attention was redirected to her next prey. She ran at a speed which should have been impossible for a member of her species, avoiding the desperate fire from the secondaries of a Sith tank. Arya vaulted over the last-ditch defensive fire of her target and landed on its side. Her glowing blade sliced through the weapon's barrels, then she jumped down and rolled under the tank, which was suspended over the ground by its repulsors. She slammed her blade into the flat armor of the machine and started cutting a way through it. That gave her few calm seconds to think. The last couple of days were the best in her short life. It was a radical shift from what she knew from her brief time with the people who had made her. For them, she was just a one-use weapon, to be unleashed and forgotten about. Her master was different. Once he had finally found the time to give her, and what was with all that boring waiting, anyway? He made her feel important. Unique. As if she actually mattered, and that was something she had trouble believing. She was weapon with a single purpose. Or so she had been led to believe. For the ones who created her, she was just as disposable as the droids she was fighting now, or the clones were for the Republic. That had been something she had been able to sense even then, hours after being released from the cloning cylinder. She had been all right with that. She had no reason for existing then. No purpose. They gave her one and she had been grateful for that. Now, Arya knew it for the lie it was. All of it. Now, she was being trained to use the Force right. As a real Sith should, not like the Confed fools who trained her for her one-way mission. She smiled wickedly as her lightsaber finished cutting through the tank's armor. Arya threw away the slab of metal barring her way as well as the droid crew of the tank, after taking them apart. She took a long look inside, and then she used the Force to manipulate the machine's controls. As Arya took aim and opened fire on an AA emplacement, a content smile appeared on her face. Her master's teaching were helping become her own person, not just a disposable copy. Slowly but surely, the Force was setting her free. Ryloth, Endgame, =RK=, Part 3, 200 kilometers northeast of Lesu, Ryloth. Bo-Katan was flying over a rocky desert, riding a speeder bike, which she had borrowed from the Gar forces. She had been contracted by the Republic General to find out the location of the local resistance leader, Syndula, who had his hideout somewhere in the desert surrounding the capital city. The bleak brown landscape around the Mandalorian woman was littered with the burned-out hulks of cis-landing ships, shattered droids and the burned-out frames of vehicles used by the Ryloth security forces, which had made a futile effort to stop the Confed army. This was the region where the man she was seeking operated. Thanks to her short time as a mercenary for the Cis, Bo knew where to start the search for her quarry. She hid her ride into the twisted ruin of a crashed transport and patiently waited. That in turn gave her some time to think about her situation. Bo-Katan was in a bind. She simply couldn't refute that man's arguments. Because of her leader's orders, the Death Watch was liable to be painted in the same light as the Cis, as a bunch of slavers and common murderers. And many within the organization's ranks would revel in receiving such reputation. Was that what the Mandalorians were seen as by everyone outside their culture? What she believed in was that her people were honorable warriors, the best the galaxy has ever seen. That was what they should strive for once their thin veneer of pacifism was lifted. Chris sat on the warm sand partly burying the wreck she was using as cover and frowned. Bo had the nagging feeling that what she wanted for her people and the aims of the Death Watch might not be the same. Then there was her loyalty to Vizsla. It was one of the rare times she didn't know what to do. =RK=, Republic Cruiser Requiem, Task Force Retribution flagship, high orbit over Ryloth. In one of the cavernous hangars of the Venator, Kenobi was attending a meeting, in which Vale's plan to resolve the situation on Ryloth was fleshed out. "Who put that lunatic in charge?" exclaimed Captain Trent Wombers, of the escort carrier Reprisal. He hated his ship's role in the madness that was being planned. Solo, who, along with his Wookiee first officer attended the meeting, shrugged at his colleague's antics. "It may work," said the Corellian. "Ruah." The Wookiees below of approval echoed around the hangar. "It's certainly an interesting idea," mused Yularen. "Under normal circumstances, I would say that even if it works as planned, it would be too expensive to attempt." The Admiral trailed off and looked at the deck plating, and the planet far below them. "The ship should hold," Lieutenant Commander VCT-091 added his 2 credits. "Should or will?" Yularen looked sharply at the Requiem's chief engineer. "Those container ships are extraordinarily tough for merchant vessels. However, they were not built in with determined attack by military weaponry in mind. It can survive a strike or two from proton cannon, especially when you consider that those craft are going on a one-way mission," answered Vector. "If those shells don't strike something vital." The engineer shrugged. "What about passing through the theater shield over the capital?" asked Kenobi. The clone smirked. "Usually it would be a no-go. However, if the shield configuration has not been changed, which is unlikely given the terrain at the site, it will work." "It better," grumbled Obi-Wan. The Jedi didn't fancy getting splattered over the city's shields, not to mention what would happen to the regiment of clones he would lead. "It's done," a too-young voice shouted behind Kenobi. He turned around and saw a young, grease-covered boy no older than 14, exit from under a damaged bomber. Around the kid a pair of clones, wearing colors announcing them as engineers, were busy removing a shredded engine. Good work, kid. Now give me that number 6 spanner, said one of the men wearing Jango Fett's face. Right away, fixer, exclaimed the kid, who had a cheerful grin on his grime-covered face. Since when do we have children fixing our ships? Asked the Jedi. Since the general found himself an apprentice who happens to be a genius with everything mechanical. Deadpanned Vector. Say, what? Exclaimed Kenobi. The Jedi shook his head in exasperation. The Chiss woman wasn't enough, was she? Vale appeared to be doing his best to push the council buttons. Obi-Wan knew that the Jedi Masters wouldn't be thrilled to learn that Del-Qatar had taken second apprentice. The fact that the woman who led the attack on the temple was not only under Vale's protection, but his student was bad enough, but this? They would believe that Del-Qatar was corrupting the kid, despite the fact that Kenobi was sensing no darkness from the boy. What criffing mess. RK equals 200 kilometers from Lesu, Ryloth. Bo-Katan's musings were interrupted when a platoon consisting of B-1 and super battle droids marched past her hiding place. From the machine's chatter it became clear that they were searching for a missing patrol. Undoubtedly one that had ran afoul of the resistance fighters. She smirked. Splendid. Those tin cans would lead her straight to her quarry. Kryz let them pass and stalked after the droids. RK equals Lorik Pass, Torangwa Mountains, Ryloth. The thin mountain route, which was sneaking through the canyon behind me, ended amongst desert dunes strewing from here to the capital and beyond. Veer's surviving tanks were moving out to screen the advance of the Walker column, which was still a kilometer behind us. After we dealt with the second Sis ambush, I had the transports of Eagle Flight deposit a company of troopers and me, at the exit of the pass. There we took defensive positions until my main forces were clear of the bottleneck. To my pleasant surprise, there were no more attacks while my men were braving the mountain passes. Within hours I would have 3 mechanized regiments loose in the desert. I hoped that they would be enough to sweep clean the way to the capital. It was at that time, when my comm came to life with signal relayed from one of the ship in orbit. Vale, I've got his location. I heard Bo-Katan's pleasant voice. She continued speaking, giving me the coordinates of the resistance hideout as well as the best way to approach it in order to minimize the chance of detection. Splendid work. You earned yourself a bonus, I told her cheerfully. I cut orders to my soldiers to head towards the capital city at moderate speed, while dispatching scouts for ambushes in the desert, before I went to retrieve Arya, who was resting at a temporary command post near the pass end. It was time to visit the locals. RK equals Resistance HQ, location classified, Ryloth. A flight of LART/I transported a platoon of my 11th Legion and me 5 kilometers from the crashed Sis landing ship, which the Resistance was using as a headquarters. It was a small enough force not to alarm the locals too much, while strong enough to give us a good fighting chance if they turned out to be hostile. Or so I hoped. Few minutes after we landed and the transports flew back to the safety of my advancing regiments, Bo-Katan melted out of the brown sands surrounding us. Took you long enough, she grumbled. What were you doing? Took the scenic route or something? I looked around us. Unless you consider endless sand dunes with a lot of burned-out military equipment lying around a tourist attraction, we didn't do such a thing. In my opinion, the fact that we were in a desert was more than enough to disqualify this region from my vacation list. That we did. I deadpanned. Sand and scorching heat everywhere. We just couldn't miss seeing it all. She shook her head at me, but I could feel a tingle of amusement fighting with her irritation. Can't blame her. I would be in even a worse mood if I had to sulk around the desert for a day or so in a search for the bloody resistance. This way. Bo-Katan waved us to follow her. Try not to move like a bunch of toy soldiers on a parade, she added. It was my men's turn to grumble. They didn't appreciate being bad-mouthed by what they believed to be an ordinary merc. Children, play nice. We have a job to do, I said aloud. Kryz glanced my way and muttered something too quiet for me to hear. Nothing flattering, I bet. It took us nearly 2 hours to sneak to the resistance hideout. It was slow but easy task, when I could sense their sentries from a long way off. We were about 150 meters from the entrance to the hideout, which was through the busted landing bay doors of a Sis landing ship. I made a sign to my men to hold their position and waved to Bo-Katan to follow me. I would have preferred to execute this exercise with at least a couple of companies at hand and preferably few SF teams ready for action, but my transport units were tasked to capacity. All in the name of a deception I hoped would win me Ryloth with minimum casualties from my men. I removed my helmet and walked towards the entrance. I could hear shouts of surprise and distress. The locals found out that their perimeter was breached without them noticing. The sentries we bypassed would have some pointed questions to answer, the unfortunate sods. "Hi, there folks." I waved at a pair of Twi'lek males who ran out of the wreck with blaster rifles pointed my way. "I'm here to see General Syndula. Be nice chaps and go fetch him." I said it all with nonchalant smile on my face. Bo-Katan, who was to my right, was staring at me. No doubt, she was wondering what the hell was I doing. The men looked at me, then at each other and ran back in. I beamed at Chris who was scowling at me under her helmet. "I can't believe that worked," she muttered. "Lucky bastard." Dominating the minds of weak-willed people had always been handy for the Force adepts who knew how to do it. Few minutes, and couple of squad of sentries, who had come near my men taken into custody. Later, a tired-looking, orange-skinned Twi'lek came out. He was accompanied by 20-odd men and women, who were carrying a diverse assortment of blasters. They all looked worse for the wear. The group had a sense of exhaustion around them. Syndula looked at me with a stare I've seen before. On men and women who had seen too many horrors on the battlefield and were close to breaking. I was well aware that all the resistance had managed to do is merely inconvenience the Seps, in their race to ship as many locals as possible to the slave markets controlled by the Hutts. The failure to do more than saving a few of his people, was taking its toll on the resistance fighters. "You found us," stated Syndula. "So the Republic finally deigns to notice our pleas?" He looked at the dunes around us, which were nested within deep shadows. "General Syndula," I said aloud. "I came here to make you an offer." "Is that so? The mighty army of the Republic ridding to the rescue? Or are you another bunch of overlords who come to place us under the yoke?" He glared at me. "Look around us. Thousands of my men lie buried on these plains. Do you know why, Republic?" I rolled my eyes. It wasn't the diplomatic thing to do, however I've never been particularly good when dealing with local resistance fighters. Especially those that were supposed to be on my side. I probably was biased, but in my experience, they usually were more trouble than they were worth. At least those on non-imperial worlds during the last war. "I'm sure you'll enlighten us, General." I managed to say it with neutral tone. "Huh? I think that the use of the dark side was affecting me a bit. Was I getting arrogant, or perhaps I was just biased against most people of this day and age? When the droids came, we were alone. Unarmed. We were going to surrender, but they came with tanks and tried to ground us down or place a slave collars on our necks. Where was the Republic when we needed it?" He glared at me. "Millions of my people were taken, and now you come?" Yeah. He was right. During this war the Republic had failed the very reason it existed, providing security to its member worlds. When all was said and done, the economic benefits were always secondary. Or they were during my time. Then at least the Republic worked, however badly. Ironically, if it was not for the so-called Sith Sidious, who arranged the creation of the Gar, it would be ripe for the taking. Hell, it was anyway. The army was already stretched to the breaking point. It will be months until Kamino could have enough clones ready so the line could be held with any certainty. Perhaps even longer until the new recruits, which were enlisting by the freighter load, could be ready for battle. Two things could stop the Gars from collapsing in the next few months. Palpy's meddling with the Sith strategic planning, because of which the Confed armies had almost run out of steam and will need to stop their major offensives for at least a couple of months, and if everything went without further problems, Corellia's entrance in the war on our side. All that would give me time to consolidate my power base and put few plans in motion. If I was able to wrap the mess on Ryloth soon, that is. "You have a decision to make, General. You can let your grievances get the better of you and continue irritating the Sith while they enslave your people. At best. Or you can help me liberate them. The only reason more of your people are not shipped to the Hutts as we speak, is my fleet in orbit. The same fleet which paid a terrible price in blood and ships to kick the Separatists' navy out of this star system." I looked him in the eyes. "I have a 200,000 strong army on the ground. Those men are the best chance your people have. What will it be, General Syndula? Equals RK equals. Lesu, Ryloth. Wat Tambor glared at the hollow image of Count Dooku. He had requested reinforcements, which were to break through the Republic Navy in orbit and allow him to save his skin. Denied, snapped the Sith Lord. We are trapped on the ground. The Republic have parked a pair of cruisers overhead. I can't leave Ryloth, protested Tambor. You lost a full fleet in what should have been an ambush for the Republic forces, fumed Dooku. Your stunt at Ryloth already cost us dearly. Minutes ago Corellia announced that they are joining the war on the Republic side. After your strategic blunder, we no longer have the forces at hand to easily crush our enemies. Now instead of short victorious war, we are looking at one of attrition. The Count's glare made Tambor shake in fear. You will start bombing all settlements in range of our forces on Ryloth. The Republic's victory there must be a hollow one. Dooku took a deep breath. At the moment there are no forces to spare for your misguided adventure, Tambor. I will not weaken another front to save your worthless hide. The Sith Lord turned his head to the right, where a tactical droid was holding a hollow emitter in front of Tambor. Follow my orders, growled the one-handed man, before cutting the connection. Far away from Ryloth, Dooku pondered his situation. He had his hands full. After his not brief enough visit to the Jedi Temple, he had to re-establish his power base within the Confederation. The madness that Tambor had somehow hatched would hound them for years to come. It was almost as bad as the fiasco on Coruscant. He growled and strands of darkness whipped around him as dark-side-fueled fury festered within his heart. Once he got his hand on the fools who had botched the Coruscant raid, he would keep them screaming for a long time. The only bright light in the end of the hyperspace tunnel was that thanks to the reinforcements the Republic was rushing to Ryloth, the Sith would be able to take control of a few contested planets. Back on Ryloth, Tambor stared at the tactical droid who refused to follow his orders. He looked at the heavens, where the Republic cruisers were waiting. The Emir thought about using the Lesu's population as bargaining chips to buy his freedom, but then remembered who was leading the enemy forces. The cyborg felt like a trapped animal. Ryloth Endgame. Part 4. 5 kilometers from Lesu, Ryloth. I was riding in a command walker with General Syndula and a group of clone officers, who were helping me plan the assault of the capital. We were even patched to Coruscant, so Senator Taff and by extension the Chancellor could be aware of our intentions. That had resulted in an amusing verbal sparring match between the resistance leader and the politician who was supposed to represent Ryloth. Of course, it was all a giant deception, just in case Palpy was feeding the local Separatist forces real-time intel on my plans. Only my men in orbit and I were aware of the scope of the trick I was trying to pull off. For everyone with actual combat experience or a bit of military sense, attacking the capital with 3 mechanized regiments and few hundred locals as auxiliary would look like an expensive suicide attempt. By my most conservative estimates, there were at least 100,000 droids defending the city. More than enough to destroy my few regiments if I attacked them head-on. According to the intelligence I had, there were supposed to be only a quarter of that number in Lesu, but I didn't trust those numbers. That city was the most important place on the planet as far as the Sith was concerned. At least while Tambor, who had the droid army deactivation codes, was there and in one piece. My plan should work even if that bastard bought the farm, but in such a case, the casualties my men were going to suffer would be astronomical. We need to seize the plasma bridge. It's the only way to pass through the city shields without a prolonged siege, said Syndula. He was looking at a tactical map representing the capital. On it could be seen many angry red designation, each of which was showing known enemy positions. That didn't even include the anti-personnel turrets that lined the city walls. There were few hundred of those things. Another problem was the proton cannons hidden in the city. They would cripple any ship overflying the city from anything lower than high orbit. Those weapons and the theater shield covering the capital made the Sith commanders within Lesu confident that they could hold for a long time. I planned to dissuade them from that notion. Let's hope that the Separatists believe that too, I muttered. The resistance leader gave me a sidelong glance. The display in which the data from the sensor monitoring the surrounding airspace started beeping. Everyone's heads turned that way. So it begins, I muttered. RK equals. Escort carrier retaliation, 500 kilometers from Lesu, Ryloth. On the bridge of the modified container ship, Jolie Solo grinned like a maniac. He was given command of the ship, after her previous skipper, a volunteer civilian, had refused to execute what he saw as a suicide mission. The Corellian scoundrel jumped at the chance to take command of the carrier. It was just too bad that he was about to wreck this one too. In front of his craft, the last escort carrier in the Republic fleet over Ryloth was plunging through the atmosphere at a dangerous velocity. Its shields were glowing white in an attempt to disperse the heat generated by the re-entry. Soon enough that would be the least problem for that ship. Reprisal was flying with only a pair of clones on her helm. They had volunteered for the task. If those men were lucky, they might even make it to the special escape pod mounted next to the bridge. Reprisal was flying as a shield for Retaliation, which carried 2 clone regiments led by General Kenobi. The former container ships forced their way through the atmosphere fast enough to shred their shields into tatters. The twin craft's bows started glowing red from the molecules of air hitting their hull. The escort craft roared through the heavens, on a course leading straight towards the capital. The droids monitoring for space-borne threats noted the 2 descending ships, paused for few seconds when their databanks registered them as merchant vessels, before deciding that those things were a threat anyway. Proton cannons raised from their hiding places, tracked their quickly approaching targets and opened fire. Reprisal shook from near misses, while the enemy artillery zeroed in on the carrier. The craft, which was on its final flight, disregarded the enemy fire and continued its doomed approach. The following shots struck the bow of the ship, rending huge holes in its civilian-grade hull. The pilots put the engines in overdrive and sent the escort carrier straight at the city itself. They locked in the course on autopilot and ran toward the escape pod. The clones reached the lifeboat and were just entering it when a proton shell struck the Reprisal in the exactly wrong place. The pod disappeared into a short-lived storm of fire, which turned the 2 men into so much mincemeat. Despite the loss of its pilots, the escort carrier continued on its path, tanking shot after shot. She reined behind, pieces of her fuselage, which were torn away by enemy fire, yet she continued doing her duty. The ship's course had been painstakingly calculated, so even if she was destroyed, her pieces would rain all over the shielded city, providing cover for her sister ship. 200 kilometers over Lesu, Reprisal was hit one too many times and she blew up. Yet, most of her mass had too much momentum, and continued tumbling on the same vector. Flaming pieces of the destroyed ship rained all over the shield protecting the capital. It was like a barrage of shooting stars, which intercepted the majority of the artillery fire aimed at the Retaliation. The second carrier flew through the air in a shroud of flaming atmosphere. She appeared to veer off its headlong plunge at Lesu, before straightening her course under the deft hands of Jolie. "Hold on, girl," chanted Solo. Next to him, his friend shook his massive, furry head. "Row," protested the Wookiee, when Jolie suddenly guided the refitted transport straight at the ground. "No worries, buddy. I know what I'm doing," answered the Corellian. "Rawa," grunted Trow. "What do you mean, that's what you're afraid of?" Retaliation struck the ground 7 kilometers away from the city and skidded across the dunes. She left in her wake a deep gorge in both rock and sand. Her repulsors whined in protest, when Solo overloaded them in attempt to slow down the crash-landing ship. "I know they aren't meant for this stuff. Trust me. They'll handle it," shouted Jolie. The Wookiee glared at him, but followed his instructions. One after another those devices suffered critical overloads and either exploded or melted, but they did the job the Corellian forced them to do. The escort carrier, which was skidding across the ground, slowed down enough to pass through the theater shield instead of smashing into it. The forward section of the ship went over the deep chasm surrounding the capital, creating an artificial bridge over it. Retaliation's nose struck Lesu's wall hard enough to shatter a part of it, obliterating the nearby anti-personnel turrets. == 4 kilometers from Lesu, Ryloth. I stared at the camera feed in awe. That crazy Corellian pulled it off. All units, this is General Vale. Execute Trinity. Now. I repeat. I ordered, using one of the comms which was tuned on so it can transmit to all of my forces on and above Ryloth. Get us to the Retaliation ASAP. I told our driver, before smiling crookedly to Syndula. You are all insane, he declared. You know the alternative, General Syndula. Months-long siege in which the Force only knows how many people will die. Now we have a bridgehead into the city, and if we move fast enough, we'll be able to keep it open. I nodded towards the hollow map showing my forces all over the planet. There could be seen the signs of regiments attacking the 10 biggest camps holding the local population captives. That was a necessary sideshow. While the actions of that part of my forces was important, it was little more than diversion. A swarm of green dots rising from our primary LZ could be seen on the plot. All of them were heading towards the capital. Those were LAT/T carrying another mechanized regiment, with the rest being transport variants chock full with heavy infantry. We needed to not only keep our bridgehead open, but if possible strike deeply in the city. My orbital assets had noted the location of the enemy proton cannons. Once those were taken out, I had 2 acclimators full with fresh troops, ready to deploy. If we could neutralize the theater shield, then those men could land directly in the city. == Retaliation's landing site, Lesu, Ryloth. By the Force. It worked, exclaimed Kenobi. The carrier had been shaking in such a way that all of them thought that she was about to fly apart thanks to Solo's insane piloting. But the Corellian came through for them. The capital's defensive shell was cracked. It was time for Obi-Wan to make up for his terrible decision during the initial phase of the landings. "Blow up the charges. We are going in," shouted Kenobi. The clone sergeant sitting next to him just nodded and pressed a button on his left arm guard. That was a scene repeating itself in each surviving cargo container on the Retaliation. Shaped charges detonated, cutting through the thin sheets of metal which had protected the clones during the descent. With their path blown open, 2 regiments of infantry surged out of the escort carrier, leaving behind nearly a battalion wounded or dead suffered from the few proton shells which hit their ride during its re-entry. Whole companies armed with heavy weaponry converged to the sides of the ship and opened fire on all threats in sight. The anti-personnel emplacements covering the wall answered with crimson beams of concentrated death and managed to scythe down 19 clones before being silenced forever under a storm of heavy blaster fire or repeated missile strikes. Kenobi was the first to run up to the nose of the ship and jump into the city. He landed on a rubble-covered street with a smile on his face. Vale's regiments were few minutes behind, and there was no way the droids could execute a strong enough attack to dislodge them from the foothold they had within Lesu. Besides, the machines would have other things to worry about too. Overhead, Bo-Katan, a mercenary Vale had somehow persuaded to switch sides, flew on her rocket pack. She, and teams consisting of the best soldiers in the Liberation Force would head into the capital ahead of the main force. They would hunt down the proton cannons and try to neutralize the shield protecting the city. A door opened to the left of the Jedi, disgorging a squad of B-1s. The group of cannon fodder lasted for a couple of seconds, before the general shattered them against a nearby wall with a telekinetic push. "Follow me," he ordered to the first group of clones who rappelled into the city. The battle for Lesu had just begun. == Bo-Katan flew over the city with a smile on her face. Ever since the proton cannons in Lesu opened fire, she and the hunter teams received up-to-date information from one of the cruisers in orbit. They knew where every one of the weapons that fired was. She flew 100 meters above the ground, heading to her first target. She passed around the side of a tall skyscraper and saw her prey. A pair of cannons were covering the sky over both directions of a long boulevard. Kryz headed to the ground and sent a heavy missile at one of the mobile weapon which was pointing her way. The ponderous cannon tried to acquire her, but it wasn't designed to deal with such an agile target. An organic or better program droid might have fired anyway, in hope that it would take her out. But the robot controlling the artillery piece hesitated while waiting for targeting solution. It would wait forever, because moments later the missile smashed through the light armor protecting the proton cannon just under its barrel. The warhead detonated within the self-propelled weapon and blew it up rather spectacularly. Bo flew over few squads of B-1s, which were carrying out sentry duty for the arty pieces, and strafed them, shooting with her blaster pistols. Before the fragile robots could manage something better than a couple of stray shots, which never came close to endangering the Mandalorian woman, she was upon them. Thanks to years of training and her armor's built-in targeting system, her fire was deadly accurate. Only a single lucky machine remained in her wake. A pair of super battle droids, leading 2 squads of their light brethren, were guarding the second proton cannon. Their Kryz didn't bother using her blasters. Instead she sent 4 rockets from her wrist-mounted launcher. Those dumb munitions flew straight where she aimed them and obliterated the droids in flashes of light and fire. Before heading to her next target, Bo-Katan threw a thermal detonator at the remaining cannon. Her parting gift turned the weapon into another piece of scrap blocking the boulevard. =RK=, holding camp codename Helos, Southern Hemisphere, Ryloth. Cody was examining through a binocular a large clearing in the jungle. It was a circle, 5 kilometers in diameter. 200 meters from the surrounding trees, there was a fence made of barbed wire. Towers on which were stuck searchlights, various cheap sensors and repeating blasters were erected on the perimeter of the camp, on a 300-meter intervals. Half their weapons were pointing in. In one corner, the commander could see a makeshift spaceport on which a squadron of vultures were standing in their walker configuration. The reason for that was the pair of transports which were stranded on the landing pads. Those craft were undoubtedly there to lift loads of enslaved locals. They were obviously unwilling to brave the gauntlet of the Republic Navy in orbit. Cody, who was accompanied by the few combat-ready survivors of Ghost Company, was in charge of liberating that particular camp. There were supposed to be at least 50,000 Twi'lek cramped in it. He prayed to whoever, or whatever was listening, that this operation would turn out better than his last. Not that it could get much worse. The commander cringed at that thought. He was leading a whole regiment of his Sky Corps, and there were tens of thousands of locals that could die if he criffed up. It actually could go much worse. He glanced left and right at his few surviving friends from Ghost. Cody had full command authority on this mission, as well as generous rows. Do anything you have to achieve the objective. He could work with that. The usually stoic clone grimaced. Until the landing of Ryloth he had believed that General Kenobi knew what he was doing. That was the reason he hadn't protested when the Jedi had ordered them in without heavy weapons. That particular delusion lasted until they struck the Clankers' outer lines. It was the first time Cody truly felt that the Jedi were amateurs in the art of warfare. Very talented ones, where Kenobi and Skywalker were concerned, but amateurs nonetheless. An experienced officer would have known that attacking an entrenched position with light weaponry only was a suicide. It was a miracle that Kenobi managed to lead them to victory. Ghost had at least succeeded in achieving their objective. Skywalker's men were not so fortunate. General Vale had to call in an orbital strike on their position to salvage something of the debacle. To make matters worse, Crate Company, who went after their objective loaded for Rancor, managed to fulfill their part of the overall mission with only light casualties. It was a painful example, showing the difference between the Jedi generals and Vale. Cody only hoped that General Kenobi had learned his lesson and won't waste his brothers' lives again. All units, this is General Vale. Execute Trinity. Now. I repeat. General Vale's orders sounded over the commander's comm. Cody ended his musing and turned his head towards his XO. You heard the man, growl. Fire for effect on all marked targets. Right away, sir. A barrage of missiles descended upon the camp. Guard towers were shattered, the few patrolling tanks were blown to pieces scattered over few hundred meters, and special munitions blew lanes through confirmed and suspected minefields. On the other side of the clearing, the spaceport was turned into firestorm after 30 missiles struck the vultures, transports and fuel tanks. Yet more explosions sounded when the Sis motor park, containing the rest of their armor, was hit too. In the same time, smoke grenades detonated, obscuring the clearing between the jungle and the fence. Moments later, Cody's leading platoons charged the enemy lines, which were thrown into disarray. Nearly 70 kilometers from the camp, Larts of all types lit up their engines and rose from their camouflaged positions. They were bringing in CAS, the regiment's armor elements, as well as additional medics that would be sorely needed.